People think reality responds when you want something badly enough. That if you feel it harder, believe it stronger, visualize it longer, the universe will finally move. But what if the very act of trying is the reason nothing shifts? What if the door only opens when you stop pushing on it? There exists a quiet state of the mind where change becomes possible in a way logic cannot predict. It does not arrive with excitement, hunger, or emotional intensity. It appears when the inner noise fades, when the constant commentary inside you softens into silence. To the conditioned mind, this state feels empty, almost unproductive. And because it feels like nothing is happening, it is often ignored. We were trained to believe that influence comes from effort, that to bend reality, we must apply pressure from the inside. More intention, more visualization, more emotional charge. But the deeper mechanism of change works in the opposite direction. It does not amplify force, it clears the interference. Most human minds operate in a mode of constant scanning, anticipating the next problem, rehearsing identity, maintaining control over what feels familiar. This mode keeps you functional in the world, but it also traps you inside repetition. A system obsessed with prediction can only reproduce what it already knows. It cannot host the unknown without feeling threatened by it. When the nervous system lives in control, it asks one silent question again and again. What must I manage next? And a mind that is busy managing cannot allow something genuinely new to enter. Change requires openness, but control tightens the field. This is why so many attempts at transformation collapse back into the same patterns. The surface thoughts may shift, but the inner state remains unchanged. Consciousness does not move through force, it moves through clarity, like a lens that only brings an image into focus when the dust is removed. When the inner conflicts quiet down, attention becomes steady, not tense, not collapsed, simply available. In that availability, choice can emerge without struggle. This state is not created by pushing the mind into calm. It appears when the inner arguments dissolve on their own, when parts of you stop pulling in opposite directions. The brain naturally shifts into a slower rhythm because there is nothing left to defend, no urgency to protect, no pressure to become. People who touch this state often describe change as something that happened through them, not by them. They did not feel like creators forcing outcomes into form. They felt like witnesses to a movement that arose effortlessly, not because they wanted less, but because nothing inside them was fighting the moment anymore. The mind finds this unsettling because it cannot take credit for stillness. The habits that society rewards make this state feel unsafe. Constant striving, over-attachment to results, the identity built around becoming someone. Stillness is mistaken for stagnation. Silence is confused with absence. Neutrality is misread as loss of self. But neutrality is not emptiness. It is readiness. In this quiet field, desire no longer battles fear. Identity no longer waits for proof. The inner tension between not yet and what if comes to rest. When that oscillation stops, reality no longer hovers in possibility. It resolves into form. Most people brush past this doorway without recognizing it. They feel the calm and assume something is wrong. They label it boredom, lack of motivation, emotional flatness, and they rush back into stimulation, effort, wanting. But this stillness is not a dead end. It is the threshold. Once you see this pattern, you stop chasing manifestation as a task. You begin preparing the inner space where movement can occur on its own, not by forcing the mind to do more, but by allowing the noise to fall away until reality finally has room to respond. When the inner noise finally fades, the choice has already occurred. Nothing needs to be pushed into place. The movement is subtle, almost invisible to the part of the mind that wants credit for action. The reason most people rarely enter this state has little to do with talent, intelligence, or spiritual effort. It is rooted in something more ancient, the instinct to survive. The human nervous system evolved to recognize what is familiar, not to welcome what is unknown. Even discomfort feels safer when it is predictable. Familiar patterns become a kind of shelter. The system learns which forms of tension it knows how to carry. So it asks, again and again, what version of life can I endure? And then it rebuilds that version with quiet precision. Continuity feels like safety, even when it keeps the same limitations in place. This is why silence feels unsettling to the mind. Silence removes the landmarks the brain uses to orient itself. Without constant reference points, the sense of time softens. The story of who you are loses its sharp edges. To the nervous system, this loss of orientation resembles danger. So the mind fills the space. Thoughts appear like footsteps in an empty room. Plans line up to restore a sense of direction. Urgency tightens the body back into motion. Desire grows louder, doubt quickly follows. All of this feels like forward movement, but beneath the surface, it is a reflex to regain control. When you begin to settle inwardly, the mind often responds with sudden tasks. Fix this, improve that, prepare for what might go wrong. It does not do this to sabotage you. It does this to protect the identity it has learned to maintain. What we call identity is not a solid thing. It is a rhythm the brain has practiced for years, a familiar arrangement of signals that repeats until it feels like a self. As long as this rhythm dominates, the same version of you keeps returning, and the same inner landscape tends to invite the same outer outcomes. At the level of consciousness, reaction is not the same as choice. Reaction is shaped by memory. Choice becomes possible only when those patterns loosen their grip. When the mind stops echoing the past into the present, awareness can sense options it could not perceive before. Without that pause, life continues to mirror what is already known. This is why change can feel circular. You may want something new with sincerity, yet the inner atmosphere that formed the old reality remains intact. The field responds accurately to that atmosphere. It does not argue with your wishes. It reflects your state. There is another subtle force that strengthens this resistance: the way the mind relates to time. The brain moves in sequences. What happened shapes what is now. What is now predicts what will come. But possibility does not follow this straight line. When awareness selects, it does not wait for time to catch up. It opens a path that did not exist in the previous storyline. This feels threatening to the part of the mind that wants to manage progress. If the future is not guaranteed by past effort, the role of control dissolves. So the brain leans on familiar narratives. I need more time. I am not ready yet. I must become someone else first. These stories sound reasonable, but they quietly keep attention anchored to the same identity. This is why moments of true openness often arrive unexpectedly, in awe, in deep presence, in the soft release after grief has passed. In those moments, the usual scripts fall silent. There is no plan to follow, no role to perform. Awareness steps forward because nothing else is speaking. People often describe these moments as timeless, not because the clock stops, but because the mind is no longer rehearsing what comes next. In that gap, something new becomes available. Yet the doorway is brief. The mind quickly returns with interpretation and strategy. What was that experience? How do I recreate it? What should I do now? And with those questions, the familiar noise resumes. This state cannot be commanded. Force belongs to the circuits of control. What allows the shift is a temporary release of grip, not a permanent withdrawal from life. Just enough space for awareness to move without interference. This is also why practices built only on discipline often reach a ceiling. They train the mind to regulate itself more efficiently. But regulation is not the same as coherence. And coherence is what allows reality to reorganize itself around a quieter center. Control, even when it looks refined and spiritual, is still a form of resistance. The state that allows reality to reorganize itself does not come from mastering the mind. It comes from letting the mind step out of the way. Not as an enemy to be silenced, but as a guardian that needs to learn it is safe to rest. The shift most people never make is subtle. The goal is not to force the brain into silence. The goal is to let the nervous system discover that quiet is not collapse, that neutrality is not disappearance, that identity does not dissolve when effort pauses. When the system learns this, it stops reacting to stillness as a threat. Silence can remain without being immediately filled. And when that happens, reality begins to respond with consistency rather than randomness. The next question naturally arises. If this state is so potent, how do you recognize it without misjudging it? How do you remain in it long enough for something to shift? The difficulty is that this state does not arrive with fireworks. It does not feel productive. It does not carry emotional charge. It does not resemble the feeling of progress you were taught to expect. Often, it feels like a simple absence of urgency in a place where urgency once lived, and the mind quickly labels that absence as a problem. We have been trained to associate movement with tension. If something matters, we believe we should feel driven toward it, focused, activated, emotionally invested. So when the system quiets instead of intensifies, the mind assumes something is fading. Motivation must be disappearing. Interest must be dying. Something must be wrong. But this interpretation reverses what is actually happening. The feeling of nothingness is not the loss of awareness. It is the first moment awareness is no longer narrating itself. The inner voice that tracks progress, measures worth, and rehearses futures softens. And in its absence, people often feel a gentle disorientation. Not confusion, but a loss of familiar reference points. Neurologically, this is the moment when identity stops leaning on the future for stability. The inner contracts that say, when this happens, I can relax. When that is achieved, I can feel safe, begin to loosen. Stability is no longer postponed. It appears in the present. And because most people have only known calm as a reward, calm without a reason feels strange. Many have never experienced ease without justification, presence without stimulation, neutrality without boredom. So when this state arises, the mind rushes to fill the space. It looks for the next goal. It creates a new target. It asks, what now? Not because something is missing, but because it does not know how to exist without striving. This is the moment the doorway is usually overlooked, when inner oscillation stops, when awareness is no longer pulled between wanting and fearing, holding and releasing. It becomes simply available, and availability is what allows selection to occur. Clarity does not emerge through analysis. It appears when inner debate comes to rest, when there is no longer a negotiation about whether something is safe, allowed, deserved, or premature. That silence is not emptiness. It is decisiveness without tension. This is why people often say things shifted when they stopped caring. But what they actually released was not care. It was the need for the outcome to regulate their inner state. They stopped scanning the future for reassurance. They stopped using desire as a way to manage discomfort. When that need dissolves, the internal landscape changes on its own. Another sign of this state is a subtle change in how time is felt. The future no longer pulls attention forward. The past no longer anchors meaning with the same weight. Choices feel simpler, not because there are fewer options, but because one feels internally aligned without argument. There is less justification, less emotional bargaining. You may notice that things you once carried as questions begin to feel complete without explanation. Not solved by logic, but settled in the body. The charge simply drains away. And because the mind cannot track this kind of resolution, it assumes interest has faded or momentum has been lost. In truth, what dissolved was the tension that once kept the question alive. What actually fell away was not care, but resistance. This state is often confused with indifference because it carries no emotional spikes. But indifference is withdrawal. This state is wholeness, presence without demand, awareness without narration, a sense of self that no longer needs to perform to exist. From this inner alignment, choice becomes clean because nothing inside is arguing against it. Change feels immediate here, not because reality moves faster, but because there is no inner friction delaying it. Fear no longer needs to be negotiated with. The body does not require persuasion. Permission is no longer sought from old identities. The system is already coherent, yet this openness is easy to step out of. The moment the mind tries to name the experience, reproduce it, or use it to obtain something, tension quietly returns. Control slips back into the center. The future is consulted again, and with that, possibility remains suspended instead of resolving. This is why learning to recognize the state matters more than learning how to induce it. Recognition allows you to remain present with it. Mislabeling turns it into something to manage. Once you see that calm is not collapse, that quiet is not loss, and that the absence of urgency is not failure, you stop interrupting the process. Interruption is the only thing that prevents coherence from settling at this stage. The shift does not require effort. It requires trust in a stillness that feels unfamiliar to a mind raised on motion. And this leads to a deeper realization. Once the state appears, The real question becomes how to remain without trying to remain, how to let life respond without chasing the response. Here is the paradox. The moment you attempt to hold the state, it dissolves. Not because something went wrong, but because trying reactivates the very patterns that quiet requires to soften. Effort belongs to prediction. Prediction brings the mind back into management. As soon as the mind notices the change, that sense of ease, that subtle settling, it wants to protect it. How do I stay here? What should I do next to keep this? These questions feel careful, even wise, but they pull attention forward again. The system returns to organizing the future, and organization brings noise. This is why the state often feels brief at first. People believe they failed to hold it. They assume they are not developed enough to sustain it. In truth, the system simply returned to its familiar role, managing through anticipation. From the perspective of consciousness, this is what interrupts resolution. Availability was present. Inner debate had paused. But the moment identity tried to use the state as a tool, coherence fractured. This does not mean the state is delicate. It means it cannot coexist with grasping. Even grasping that disguises itself as discipline. Stability does not come from holding the state. It comes from letting it feel normal. The nervous system must learn that this level of quiet is not exceptional, not dangerous, not temporary. Only what feels ordinary can remain without effort. And what becomes ordinary is what you stop reacting to. When you stop evaluating the experience, it continues. When you stop naming it, it deepens. When you stop checking whether you are doing it correctly, the system settles into it on its own. This is not passivity, it is trust at the level of the body. This is why people in deep flow, deep presence, or long-trained stillness often describe the same quality in different words. They were not trying. Their system had learned to remain open without interference. Choice does not require force. It requires availability. And availability disappears the moment awareness becomes self-conscious. So the practice is not to enter the state, it is to not disturb it when it arrives. This means allowing uncertainty without reaching for explanation. Letting clarity exist without demanding proof. Letting the sense of self soften without immediately rebuilding it. If this resonates, there is no need to dissect it further. Analysis would pull you back into management. Instead, there is a simple inner signal you can offer your system, not as a demand on reality, but as a permission to stop interfering. A quiet acknowledgement that coherence does not need to be forced. When this inner alignment stabilizes, the outer world does not shift in dramatic scenes. There are no loud signs, no sudden confirmations, no cinematic turns. Instead, the environment begins to shift in subtle ways. Not dramatically, not with sudden turning points, but quietly, almost out of view. If you are waiting for something big to announce itself, you might miss these early movements. Because before events change, the underlying patterns rearrange. At this stage, the most noticeable difference is not what appears, it is what no longer persists. Friction softens. Certain problems lose their grip without ever being solved. Conversations that once felt heavy begin to feel irrelevant. Situations that used to demand emotional effort no longer require the same energy. Not because you fix them, but because you are no longer standing in the same current that created them. From the outside, this can look like neutrality. From the inside, it feels like stepping out of unnecessary struggle. This is one of the clearest signals that a new configuration has already been chosen. The old version of reality does not shatter. It gradually fades, as if the field simply stops supporting it. What no longer resonates quietly loses its hold. Another sign appears in the way opportunities arrive. They do not come wrapped in excitement or urgency. They show up as simple options that feel correct without persuasion. An invitation that does not thrill, yet does not resist. A choice that does not require elaborate reasoning. A shift that carries no promise of instant reward, yet feels internally settled. This is not intuition performing. This is coherence expressing itself through simplicity. When the mind is no longer driven by prediction, it stops chasing stimulation. Alignment becomes more noticeable than novelty. Decisions feel quieter because fewer inner voices are competing for direction. There is less internal negotiation. And because of this, many people hesitate here. They are waiting for something that feels intense. But intensity belongs to instability. Coherent shifts are understated because nothing inside is opposing them. You may also notice a reduction in external confirmation, fewer signs, less feedback. Not because connection is lost, but because reassurance is no longer required to move. The system becomes self-validating, and the field mirrors this by reducing noise around you. Silence appears. For those used to measuring progress through reaction, this silence can feel like nothing is happening. But silence is not emptiness. It is compression. The probabilities are converging. Time begins to feel different as well. The pressure to rush softens. Deadlines lose their emotional weight. The future no longer pulls attention forward with urgency. This is not avoidance. It is timing coming into alignment. When selection has already occurred internally, there is no need to force the sequence externally. Movement happens when sequence matches coherence, not when anxiety demands speed. At this point, manifestation no longer feels like an action. It becomes something you notice unfolding. And the quieter you allow this unfolding to be, the more smoothly it completes. Interfering now by seeking meaning, reassurance, or constant confirmation reintroduces prediction. And prediction delays translation into form. The field responds best when it is trusted to finish what has already begun. This is why people who experience lasting change often say they did not even realize it was happening until it had already happened. The system was too coherent to narrate itself in real time. And this brings the final realization. Recognizing these signs is not enough. The nervous system must learn to live from this state as a new baseline. This is where transformation either stabilizes or quietly dissolves back into familiar patterns. The final difference between temporary change and lasting transformation is not knowledge. It is not awareness. It is not even access to the state you have been exploring. The difference is whether this state becomes familiar enough to live from, not something you briefly visit and leave. Access is rarely the issue. Integration is. Many people touch this quiet coherence for a moment. They sense the neutrality, the absence of urgency, the strange feeling that nothing is missing. And then, without realizing it, they treat it like an experience rather than a new ground to stand on. They return to effort. They return to seeking. They return to measuring themselves against time and outcomes. Slowly, the nervous system recalibrates to the old identity, and reality follows the stronger signal. Lasting shifts remain stable only when the body learns that this new state is safe to inhabit. Not exceptional, not temporary, not fragile. This is not a mindset problem. It is a biological one. The system must learn that it does not need tension to function, striving to exist, or anticipation to feel alive. Until that learning settles into the body, coherence remains intermittent. From the perspective of consciousness, selection is not the end of the process. It is the beginning of embodiment. Awareness may open a new configuration, but identity must remain aligned with that opening. Otherwise, the field reorganizes again, not as punishment, but as consistency with the state being lived. This is why some people say change worked once and then disappeared. The shift did occur, but the system returned to the identity that generated the previous patterns. Reality simply followed the more familiar signal. Stability begins when you stop orienting your sense of self around outcomes. When you no longer scan the environment for proof that something has changed. When your inner state does not wait for confirmation to relax. The moment reality is no longer asked to reassure you, coherence stops being tested. At this stage, the mind grows quieter, not because it has been trained into silence, but because it no longer has a role to perform. Identity stops leaning into the future for validation. It rests in the present, and presence carries its own coherence. Here, change no longer feels mystical or deliberate. You are not applying methods. You are not practicing techniques. You are simply not interfering. The state that once appeared rare now feels natural, ordinary, almost uneventful. And this ordinariness is the most important sign of all. What feels ordinary to the nervous system becomes stable in reality. This is why the urge to chase the next outcome fades. When coherence becomes your baseline, outcomes arise as consequences, not objectives. The question shifts from how do I create change to how do I move without disrupting what is already aligned. And when this state becomes who you are, reality no longer responds in rare moments. It responds consistently. Manifestation is no longer something you pursue. It becomes the way the world meets you.